Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to review the three main types of receptors that are used by neurons when they're getting messages from the autonomic nervous system. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system and the way that this system controls the neurons of your body, there are two big picture classes of ways that it talks. The first way that the autonomic nervous system communicates is using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. When a neuron can listen to the message of acetylcholine, we call it cholinergic. But not every time a neuron hears the acetylcholine message will it respond the same way. So some of my cholinergic receptors that are able to listen to acetylcholine are an example of what we call ligand-gated ion channels. When we talk about a ligand-gated channel, what we mean is we're going to have a really fast response. As soon as that message is attached to this receptor, we'll send ions straight into my cell and it's going to respond right away. So when we talk about a cholinergic receptor that attaches to acetylcholine and it has this ligand-gated structure, we can also call this kind of receptor nicotinic. So anytime you hear the phrase, I've got a nicotinic receptor, it tells you two things. Number one, it tells you that this receptor opens with the acetylcholine message. And number two, it tells you that the structure of where I hear that message is a ligand-gated channel. That's what the type of many of our receptors in the autonomic nervous system. But some receptors are what we would consider metabotropic. And when we talk about a metabotropic receptor, when a neurotransmitter attaches to these receptors, we don't automatically bring ions right inside. The message might be a little bit slower, or it might be a little bit more complex, the way that we respond. When we're talking about the kind of neurons that respond to acetylcholine, they're cholinergic, but they also have this metabotropic structure. We call these muscarinic. So if you hear that we have a muscarinic receptor, again, that tells you two things. Thing number one, it responds to acetylcholine. Thing number two, it might have a complex response. That's metabotropic for you. When we're talking about the kinds of effects that can happen when each of these kinds of cholinergic receptors are activated, anytime we have a nicotinic receptor, we will always have an excitatory effect. And what this means is that I'm always either going to say, talk to your neighbor, share this message, or I'm always going to say, you need to do your response, whether that's to speed up your heart rate or slow things down, help with digestion. Anytime I activate a nicotinic receptor using acetylcholine, I will always have an excitatory effect. But remember, with my metabotropic receptors, things can be a little bit more complicated. So when I activate a muscarinic receptor using acetylcholine, it's a little bit harder for me to predict that response. When we're talking about these two types of receptors, we actually find them in different locations in the body. So my nicotinic cholinergic receptors are found on the dendrites of all of my postganglionic neurons. Now, quick word review for us here. Post means after. Ganglionic means that bump where two neurons meet. So anytime we're in the autonomic nervous system and we are spitting out acetylcholine from a preganglionic neuron who brought the message there, the postganglionic neuron will always hear that message with a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. Acetylcholine always gets them excited. When we talk about muscarinic receptors, the ones that are a little more complicated, we see these in some different places. For the parasympathetic nervous system, all of my target organs, so everybody who's part of the rest or digest response, will be covered in these muscarinic receptors. When we're looking at the places that the sympathetic nervous system uses this, we only find muscarinic receptors on the sweat glands that the sympathetic nervous system activates. That would be an underline highlight star idea. Sweat glands that are getting messages from the fight or flight system to turn on, they get that message in the form of acetylcholine. Most of the time, when the sympathetic nervous system is talking to a target organ, they're going to be using epinephrine or norepinephrine, which brings us to our other type of receptors. The other type of receptors that we use when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system are adrenergic receptors. Adrenergic receptors get their name from the other name for norepinephrine or epinephrine. That's noradrenaline or adrenaline. So we call receptors that listen to epinephrine and norepinephrine adrenergic. These adrenergic receptors are all an example of metabotropic receptors. And again, remember that metabotropic means a little bit more complicated. It's not always excitatory, not always inhibitory, it could be either. And when we're thinking about using adrenergic receptors, there are two main groups of adrenergic receptors that you should be familiar with. The first group are what we call the alpha class adrenergic receptors. The alpha class adrenergic receptors are classified this way because the kind of neurotransmitter they respond best to is norepinephrine, or in the case of its name, noradrenaline. When we look at our chart over here of the types of adrenergic receptors, notice that my first two types here on the left are my alpha receptors. There are two types of alpha adrenergic receptors, alpha 1 and alpha 2. Notice that the effects of activating an alpha 1 receptor with noradrenaline or norepinephrine are excitatory, whereas activating an alpha 2 receptor with norepinephrine is going to have an inhibitory response. So slight differences in their structure leads to the opposite kinds of effects when we spit out norepinephrine at these targets. We also have the beta class adrenergic receptors, and the beta class do the same kinds of things as the alpha class, except they listen better to epinephrine or adrenaline as we know it. So again, the beta 1 type receptors are going to lead to excitatory activities, increasing the heart rate, increasing contraction or the process of breaking down fats, whereas beta 2 adrenergic receptors are going to have inhibitory effects, so slowing down some of those things that we'd be activating for the fight or flight response. So when we're talking about adrenergic receptors, this is not something that the parasympathetic division would use. This is strictly used by that sympathetic division, the fight or flight division of the autonomic nervous system. But recognize as you're studying the alpha and beta types that sometimes that is an excitatory or an increasing response, and sometimes that is an inhibitory or a slowdown response. In addition to using adrenergic receptors, one other really important idea about the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is the way that they release their neurotransmitters. When we look at our picture here, as we've just discussed, there are different kinds of neurotransmitters that are being spit out and received at different places. When I look at my three scenarios of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system in its special case of talking to sweat glands, and the parasympathetic nervous system. Notice that in each of these scenarios, when I'm sending out messages, my preganglionic neuron, neuron number 1, is spitting out acetylcholine. Let's underline, highlight, star that. And my preganglionic neuron, in this situation, also spitting out acetylcholine. And the same deal over here, my preganglionic neuron also spitting out acetylcholine. And remember that we said that all of my postganglionic neurons, the ones that get the message at the ganglion, are all covered in nicotinic receptors. Remember that nicotinic receptors listen to acetylcholine, and it causes an excitatory effect. So it doesn't matter whether you're part of fight or flight in the sympathetic division, or whether you're part of rest and digest in the parasympathetic division. The first message you always get is acetylcholine, and it's always excitatory. Now, in the parasympathetic division, the only message they can use at all is acetylcholine. So notice that when the parasympathetic, the rest and digest division, is talking to an effector cell, we're still using acetylcholine to send that message. But this time, we're going to have a muscarinic receptor that we find on this effector cell. Remember that muscarinic means it could be excitatory or inhibitory. I have more options. But an important big idea with the parasympathetic nervous system, the only kind of message I can send is acetylcholine. In the sympathetic division, we mostly send norepinephrine or epinephrine. But notice I do have a special case where I'm using acetylcholine in the sympathetic division. And that one special place that I'm using it is when I'm talking to sweat glands, when you're breaking out in that nervous sweat because you're in fight or flight. When I'm breaking out in my nervous sweat, when fight or flight is talking to sweat glands, we are again using acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine is attaching to those same muscarinic receptors, the metabotropic ones that are able to do excitatory or inhibitory effects. So this special case, the sympathetic division talking to sweat glands, everything looks exactly the same as the way that the parasympathetic nervous system works. For the most part, though, the sympathetic nervous system is going to look very different in the way that it talks to effectors. And that's going to be because almost always it's using norepinephrine or epinephrine to talk to the cells. So notice in this case, as I'm spitting out norepinephrine in this picture, I'm activating some kind of adrenergic receptor. That could be a alpha 1, an alpha 2, a beta 1, a beta 2, depending on what I'm spitting out and what kind of effect I have, I'm going to be attaching to an adrenergic receptor. Make sure as you're learning about these different types of neurons and how they communicate, that we know what kinds of neurotransmitters they send, as well as the kinds of receptors that we find on their target cells. One last thing I want to mention about the sympathetic nervous system is that in addition to being able to use norepinephrine and epinephrine, the other thing that helps with its functionality are structures called varicosities. So when I look at what a varicosity is, imagine that I've got this neuron over here. Here's its axon. When it gets down to the place that it's going to start talking to its effector cells, it's branching out in all these different directions. And on each of these branches, you see these bubbles. These bubbles known as varicosities. So each individual varicosity is going to have neurotransmitters inside of it. As an action potential or a change in charge gets all the way down to the varicosity, as usual, it causes calcium to rush inside this bubble. And as calcium rushes inside that bubble, out rushes those neurotransmitters. Now, this signal is going from one varicosity to another varicosity all the way across this neuron. So what we end up with is several different locations along this neuron's axon where we can spit out a lot more of our neurotransmitters, and we can do it a lot more quickly than we would have done with individual axon terminals. So big pictures, as we're learning about the way that the autonomic nervous system sends messages. Make sure we know the difference between cholinergic, adrenergic receptors. Make sure we know the difference between nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. And make sure you can explain why varicosities are helpful to that sympathetic nervous system.